Thank you for joining the presentation of Puro.earth's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and geologically stored carbon methodology. This is a great opportunity to have a wide discussion about what has been created together with us and in the working group within this field of negative emissions. So let's take a look at the agenda quickly. My name is Antti Vihavainen. I am the co-founder of Puro, and I am the host for this evening session today. We are going to talk very little about Puro and then move on to the definition of carbon removal by Mark Preston Aragones from Bellona. Then Marianne is going to talk about the actual methodology, what it entails, what are the criteria, how it's measured, and so forth. She is the other co-founder of Puro and especially responsible for the supply side of our marketplace. And then we have a group of experts and people that have actually participated in the creation of this methodology. Many thanks to all of you. Some of you have been in the morning session already, and that is of course very admirable that you are taking 3 hours of your day to contribute to this discussion. But I will introduce you later on as the agenda progresses.
Antti, let me stop you there and check that you are hearing. Tony, for example, can you give a thumbs up if you are hearing? There was a comment that somebody is not hearing the presentation. Okay, so it is a local problem then. Okay, good. Moving on. So just to define, I think there are maybe some people in this call that are not necessarily completely familiar with Puro.earth. So we'd like to define ourselves as the standard for carbon removals, especially within this engineered carbon removal space. In addition to that, we also run a registry where we maintain the integrity and the life cycle of the certificates that are issued according to the standard. We're also an innovation platform because we are getting a lot of inbound traffic from companies that have worked on solving the issues with some of the methodologies or future methodologies, and it's a lot of activity taking place in this field. The most visible part of our activity is the fact that we run a B2B marketplace where companies and organizations can get access to the CORCs or the CO2 removal certificates that are issued based on these methodologies. And then finally, we are also working on a concept called Comprehensive Carbon Removal Funding Framework, which aims to improve the access to capital for the suppliers of negative emissions. This is a framework that consists of 3 parts, something we call pre-CORCs, which are securities that represent future issuance of CORCs for facilities that are to be built in the future. There's also an equity fund part, and then a global network of lenders that help then complete the funding of 10x or 100x times bigger facilities that have been run so far. So now let's move on to the beef of this session, and let's let Mark take over control of this presentation and let us hear about the definition of carbon removal. But first, it's good to define that the Bellona Foundation, it is an independent non-profit organization and was one of the first NGOs to begin championing CCS and bio-CCS
already 2 decades ago and continues to do so through collaborative platforms and research projects. So go ahead, Mark.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, can you see it? Nice.
Yeah.
Great. All right, well, thanks again for inviting me to this. My name is Mark Preston Aragones. I'm a policy advisor at Bologna Europa, which is the Brussels office of the Bologna Foundation. We are a broad environmental NGO tackling many issues, but in the Brussels office, we primarily work on industrial decarbonization, mobility, sustainable finance, and of course, carbon dioxide removal. And we engage mostly at the EU level. As was said earlier, we've been championing CCS for about 2 decades, especially on the concept of shared CO2 transport and storage networks, as the one you can see here on the cover. So I'd like to first go into a little bit on why this conversation on carbon dioxide removal is important. So as we all know, we need to mitigate emissions as quickly as possible. And this requires a combined approach to both reduce emissions and remove CO2 from the atmosphere. These are the 4 reference scenarios that were highlighted in the recent, or the somewhat recent, special report on 1.5 degrees by the IPCC. And as you can see, regardless of the level at which we reduce emissions, we will still need to deploy some form of removals at scale. The slower our emissions reductions, the more we will need to deploy CO2 removal. So how we manage to increase the supply of negative emissions becomes very important, so that we can better understand how quickly we actually need to remove CO2. So we've been working on the basis of these 4 principles, which we think collectively define the principle of carbon dioxide removal. So the first principle is that carbon dioxide is physically removed from the atmosphere. The second is that the removed carbon dioxide is stored out of the atmosphere in a manner that is intended to be permanent. Third, that all the upstream and downstream greenhouse gas emissions associated with the removal and storage process are comprehensively estimated. And 4, that the total quantity of atmospheric carbon dioxide that is removed and permanently stored is greater than the total quantity of carbon dioxide that has been emitted into the atmosphere. And we think that these 4 principles define all carbon dioxide removal processes and cut out any processes which are not. The reason we have started disseminating these is because we've seen a lot of confusion. We've seen processes which don't take carbon dioxide from the air and claim to be carbon neutral. So we might take fossil CO2 and put it into something and call that carbon negative. We've seen people say that you can take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then put it into a fuel and combine it and then, combust it. And that also qualifies as carbon dioxide removal. It doesn't. So we've been really trying to disseminate these principles as a way to get the conversation back on track. So to go a little deeper into these principles, the first principle is relatively simple on the face. Essentially, you need to actively remove CO2 from the atmosphere. The most predominant ways to do this are through plants. When they grow, they are made of carbon, so they remove CO2 from the atmosphere in the process of growing. Another method of doing this is through direct air capture, which is an example here on the left. And there are also other methods such as ocean biomass or ocean fertilization, etc. But these are much more nascent forms of carbon removal. The second way, the second principle is that the storage needs to be in a manner intended to be permanent. So this can be, again, done in a broad set of ways. On the left is the storage of CO2 in geological formations, which is much more long-term. It's assured to be safe. The risks of leakage are very small. And this is the methodology that is discussed today. There are also other ways which are more natural, such as the storage of carbon in soils, which is the image in the center, and the storage in forests and natural land sink. These natural land sinks are much less durable. They have high risks of reversibility, but they also have higher, well, it is suggested that they'd have much higher potentials to remove CO2. So in all likelihood, we'll be needing a whole bunch of ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and not just one. And this is widely understood. Then finally, there's the third principle, which in a way is the most important. And this is all the upstream and downstream emissions are included in the emission balance. And this is particularly important because if you take a shortened life cycle assessment, if you only look at one element, then your process might look like it's carbon negative, when in reality it's actually contributing to global warming. So for example, if in this example we might not include the indirect land use change effect, and without including that, a process might look like it's removing more CO2 into the atmosphere than it is emitting. But if once we include that, it might change the emission balance and be an overall emitter. So it's very important that we take as wide an assessment as possible with all the information we have at our disposal. So what do these principles mean in practice? So CCS on its own is not a form of CDR. It is a technology that you can use to get to CDR. So on the left is a typical plant which extracts CO2 from a geological store, uses it, and then that CO2 ends up in the atmosphere. If we put CCS on that facility, then we are mitigating those emissions, abating those emissions, and we end up in a carbon neutral system. So the CO2 goes out of a geological store and then goes back into a geological store. It doesn't go into the atmosphere, and that's a form of mitigation. But then there's another step, which is if we switch from using fossil CO2 to using atmospheric or biogenic CO2 with CCS, then we extract CO2 from the atmosphere, we use it, and we put it into a geological store. And that's when we achieve removals. So this is what these principles are there to make clear. These are other ways to understand to apply these principles. So they work for forests, for biomass, and for direct air capture, which is another methodology, another method which is going to be discussed today. And of course, biochar is another methodology that is used by Puro.earth to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So what are the takeaways from this definition? Carbon dioxide removal is distinct from emissions reductions. This is extremely important. There's a lot of confusion. They are two different things. You have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and put it elsewhere for a long, long time to consider something as carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions. There are many different ways of saying it. Carbon dioxide removal is supplementary to mitigation. It is not a replacement for it. It's almost always easier to not make a mess in the first place than to clean it up after. This is especially important because carbon dioxide removal will be limited by supply rather than by demand. And this is quite clear by the increasing amount of net zero pledges and the slow sort of uptake, deployment of carbon dioxide removal. But it is also possible that there will be a plateau in terms of how much we can actually deploy. So it's very important that we already in the lead up to 2030 start thinking about developing the appropriate frameworks and start deploying these technologies and processes in a sustainable manner. So that's my presentation, and thank you again very much for letting me present.
Thank you, Mark. Very good, very clear. Now, Marianne, why don't you go ahead and tell us more about the methodology itself? All right, Marianne, you are on mute and there is no video. All right, now it's better.
All right. So I was saying that it's really a proud moment to be able to be here and presenting this. But we've started this work several months ago, and now it's final draft. So it's really nice to be here presenting it. Geologically stored carbon methodology is my topic, and let me take you first a couple of years back to 2018, where Puro started. It's actually Antti who had this aha moment that carbon removal is possible, but for some reason it's not happening. And then realized that there is a business model missing and a standard missing. And that is the point when creation of Puro.earth started. In 2019, we entered into co-creation of the first methodologies, biochar, durable building materials in wood or carbonates, and then demonstrated verification and sales of that with the early customers, Tieto, SEB, and Swiss Re. In 2020, we continued after the concept itself was validated to grow with new customers like Shopify and Microsoft, and also this new methodology, our fourth methodology, geologically stored carbon. And this year, 2021, we are growing in 3 dimensions. What is a removal methodology? It is a set of rules and requirements to guarantee the high quality of carbon removal credits. It sets the minimum bar that you have to reach to be eligible and qualify to be a carbon removal project or facility. And it defines how to quantify climate impact, so how to calculate the carbon balance that Mark was also showing within the defined system boundaries and on the life cycle basis. And then this methodology is the set of rules that the verification takes as a basis and assures that they are fulfilled, both on the eligibility side and the quantification side, that the presented evidence and data can validate the claims. And like I said, more methodologies are coming to Puro.earth. We already have been reached out by innovators, operators, project developers, also buyers who want new methodologies in soil, forest, ocean. So they're coming. And if you are a visionary methodology writer, we would like you to send an email to recruitment@puro.earth. Then let's take a look into the methodology and start with the eligibility rules of the geologically stored carbon. It has 3 steps. First, you have to capture the carbon dioxide. Then you transport it to the geological storage. And these 3 steps together form the carbon removal. And the methodology includes criteria for each of these steps. So I would like to start with the capture step first. And like Mark said, 2 ways of capture are eligible for carbon removal, carbon physically removed from atmosphere. The direct air capture and then the capture through biomass. So biomass captures carbon from the atmosphere and then acts as a middle step towards the geological storing. What is not eligible is the fossil freshly out of fossil reservoir and then going back there, that is not considered as removal from the atmosphere. If we take a closer look at the biomass middle step here in the concept picture of Marx, it was shown as one green plant. If we take a closer look, it is quite many industrial processes, which all of them have their characteristics and requirements. So if we start from the left, the work group identified these 5 different variants. Carbon-containing substance is the bio-oil or slurry or something that contains the carbon and can be injected into the geological stock or forest storage. Bioenergy can be the co-product where you generate power and heat and then capture biogenic CO2 from that process. Same goes with the third one, waste incineration also has a fraction of biogenic carbon in it that turns into biogenic CO2 and can be captured. Biogas upgrading or any other process which has used biomass that originated or has taken carbon from the air, from the atmosphere, is a similar process that can be used as the intermediate step. When the biomass is used there as the capture phase, it must be sustainably grown. And this here we have built the methodology on existing sustainability requirements. There is the RED II requirement or criteria in EU that has to be followed here. And also the rule that all emissions have to be accounted for. So emissions for cultivation, harvesting, transporting, if there is land use change, also that typically when the biomass is sustainably grown, the land used is regrown to the same plant as it was what was harvested. So in summary, these carbon capture types that are qualified in this methodology, direct air capture, then the 3 variants, 5 different biogenic variants, where 4 were the carbon dioxide gas captured from a process that uses biomass. And then the biogenic carbon-containing substance, which can be a liquid or bio-oil or slurry. Then I would like to move into the storage rules, the requirements and criteria for the geological storage. And there, this methodology has based the requirements on the existing European and US regulation, or if there are similar regulation in other areas. And with that, basing on those existing legislation comes the permitting and licensing, which is then controlled by the respective authorities in those countries. So the pre-permit and permitting and issuing of post-permit control is in place in those jurisdictions. And the respective directives or criteria from EU and EPA in US are linked here. There are actually several different classes. There is one that is specifically for carbon capture and storage, the CCS phase. In EU, it's the CCS directive. In EPA, it's called Class 6, the new addition to the well classes. But then there are the others. For example, for the carbon-containing substance, Class 1, 2, or 5 can be used. And for the enhanced oil recovery plus, the Class 2 wells are the type of wells that will be used as the geological storage. So those were the eligibility rules for the beginning and the end, the capture phase and the storage phase in summary. Then if we look at the quantification rules, the carbon balance accounting, that is based on this carbon footprint or LCA accounting across the life cycle of the process. And negative carbon footprint means that you remove more than you emit. And in this methodology, we have defined a broad system boundary. So basically everything is included and has to be accounted for. And maybe worth mentioning that in all Puro methodologies, the emissions avoided or reduced are not included. It is the pure carbon removal and only that. So net negativity means that we take the first box here, the captured CO2, and measure, quantify that, and then net deduct any emissions of the project during the project lifetime, or any losses or leaks or escaped fugitive carbon dioxide during the travel from atmosphere to the storage. And to do this, there are already also existing LCA calculation principles in the ISO standard and GHG protocol. So this is not something we had to invent, but on the contrary, we have leaned on and based on what already exists there as a best practice. And since there are those variants of the biomass being used as the capture stage, there is also differences. The principles are the same for all of them, but then there are differences for different variants. And if I take examples for the quantification of the captured CO2, for example, if there is a mixed CO2 source, like in the waste incineration, only the biogenic fraction of the captured CO2 is eligible, and that has to be measured so that that is counted here in the captured CO2 quantification. For carbon-containing substance, it's different. It's not the gas. It is determined based on the carbon content of the substance, and that is turned into CO2 equivalents. And in case of enhanced oil recovery plus, which means that there is more carbon dioxide injected than you take out from the well, but all of the fossil oil taken out is deducted from the injected carbon dioxide. So in summary, the geologically removed carbon methodology defined a net CO2 removal, where the CO2 is captured from the atmosphere and stored permanently by a CO2 removal supplier. And this CO2 removal supplier concept is actually quite essential. There has to be one party who is contractually responsible for end-to-end process from capture to storage, so that they take the role of primary contractor, and then the others have contracts with the others for this carbon removal service. So key takeaways from this methodology: geologically removed carbon. Remember that it requires net negativity. No fossil CO2 is allowed, and it is strongly building on existing regulation, whether it comes to the carbon footprint accounting and also the injection wells legislation. I actually wanted to thank you, the work group here as well. So like said, we started work in the autumn. And I want to warmly thank you, everybody who contributed their time and expertise into that group. I found these discussions and meetings very interesting, and I have actually picked 2 examples here what made them so interesting. Having this very wide different aspects of expertise made it possible to look at the methodology from a meta level. So finding the common denominators of things that are quite different. They do have similarities, but there are also differences. And I think we were really lucky to have this expertise in the same meeting and see the different aspects. And then that made it possible to harmonize and make these different things comparable, also in a way that all of them have to follow the same rules, and it makes it more fair to each individual variant. I learned a lot. It was really fast pace of learning in this expert group. The other example I picked here about the discussions in the workgroup is about the trade-offs. We did understand in the beginning the trade-offs, but maybe not how multifaceted they are. So here is just an example to illustrate how the discussion went in the working group. The question here was about the equipment. Should those emissions related to the manufacturing of the capture equipment and any process equipment be included or not? And if they are included, how should they be included? And the red aspects said that they are not really significant if you look at the total thing. The blue said that everything should be accounted, and the gray said that maybe it should be accounted, but it is really big job for such a not so significant thing, and there should be then rules how to calculate it with not so huge effort. And the trade-off here was that it was the blue that they are required to be accounted for in the methodology. The gray was taken into account in a way that there is a way to calculate it with a proxy based on the capital expenditure, so not making it very difficult to calculate. And the red was incorporated in the way that if it clearly you can show that it is insignificant, less than 1%, then that calculation can be omitted, like the GH3 LCA rules say. So trade-offs were discussed with the multiple aspects of the working group. It is not only the working group who has made comments to this, and it is still open for comments, so we can clearly still improve and take in different aspects. So in summary, all of this methodology for geologically removed carbon, it's 1 metric ton of CO2 removed from the atmosphere, net of any life cycle process emissions, and intended to be permanently stored underground. I think that was all I needed to say, so let's let the experts speak.
Yes, thank you, Marianne. Indeed, really good summary, putting everything in a very compact form. So let me just share my screen from here and go and introduce our speakers and just a moment, or our panelists. Just scrolling through to the right slide, which wasn't there like the way it was supposed to be. Here we go. So first of all, let me introduce the panelists. Representing the direct air capture corner in this discussion is Louis Uzor. Why don't you say hello, Louis, to everybody?
Yes, hi everyone, also from my side. Thanks for the presentation, Mark and Marianne. It was good to hear that again, and also just sharing the pleasure of being part of this working group.
Yes, so Louis is from Climeworks, of course, the famous company that has been pioneering the direct air capture in Europe, and has also demonstrated its capability of scaling to the investors by raising a whopping $110 million last year. So very well done there. And then talking about the bio-oil variant of this, we have Shaun Meehan. Why don't you say hello as well?
Hi, this is Shaun Meehan from Charm Industrial. Thanks again for letting Charm participate in this rulemaking.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So Charm Industrial is indeed the company that converts waste biomass into bio-oil, and that is then injected into deep underground cavities as negative emissions, and we'll be happy to discuss that a little bit in more detail in a moment. And do we have Cristel with us today here?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
All
Hello.
right. Perfect.
Mr. Lambton, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel.
Yeah, great. Thanks. And she's representing the storage side indeed, and Northern Lights is definitely I think the most famous, at least here in Europe. And there is indeed an ambition to create a complete carbon capture and storage value chain for Norway and Europe. All right, and from South Pole we have EOR Plus, which means Enhanced Oil Recovery Plus, represented by Christian Ehrat. Are you here? Can you hear me?
Yes, hello everyone. Yeah, thanks also for the presentation and for the invitation for today.
All right. Thanks. And so South Pole is, of course, again, famous for, leading the world in the carbon offset side, and now has taken an active role also on the carbon removal side. So happy to have you here. And then Camilla Brox, I saw you here earlier. Hello.
I'm here. Thank you so much for having me and for letting BORG CO2 take part of this fun and interesting and important journey.
All right, great. So BORG BORG CO2 is the Norwegian company established to facilitate and manage studies on carbon capture, utilization and storage. And the long-term goal is to build an industrial CCUS cluster. Very good. So, and last but not least, definitely, is Jannicke from Oslo, Fortum Oslo Värme.
Yes, hello everybody. Jannicke from Fortum Oslo Värme, responsible for the carbon capture and storage project at our waste to energy plant in Oslo.
Very good. So there in Oslo, they have developed a CCS project based on waste to energy, and that provides a blueprint for cities across Europe on how to best deal with CO2 emissions from non-recyclable waste. Okay, so we have some questions that have been given to us earlier. So let's just go ahead and start the conversation. So Louis, first, direct air capture is very energy intensive. It takes a lot of electricity and energy to capture CO2 from thin air. How does DACCS get net negative? How are you able to remove more CO2 than you emit when all energy-related emissions are counted in the balance?
Yeah, that's a good question, and thanks for the question. I think it's to better explain the challenge, you have to think of atmospheric CO2 concentration roughly at 0.04%, so 400 parts per million. It's a lot for the climate, but actually to capture, it's rather small. And so in order to be able to capture this and have a negative impact, we really rely on renewable energy sources. So what we do with Climeworks is really we look at where is renewable energy available. Technology is somewhat independent of its location. So CO2 concentrations are roughly the same all over the world. So our approach so far has been to go where we have renewable energy sources readily available. So quite famously, we are positioned in Iceland, where we use geothermal energy with a really low carbon footprint. And this really enables us to get these negative numbers. If you look at the overall cradle to grave emissions, then it really depends on the use case, or it really depends on this energy source. And this is something that the methodology will capture, hopefully and definitely, because it's really included in the quantification. So emissions from electricity and operations, but also construction will really go into this calculation. And what we have seen in the past and what we have seen with independent analysis on our emission is really that direct air capture works, but only with the use of renewable energy sources.
Yeah, all right, very good. That's easy to believe. All right, moving on. And we will have room for additional questions presented through the chat, so feel free to present them there. So we are progressing nicely, so I'm sure that we have time for those as well. So, Shaun, bio-oil is different. You inject the bio-oil underground instead of CO2 gas. Does that impact the kind of geological formation you can use, the cavity depth and type?
Absolutely. Bio-oil, kind of as you mentioned, is a very interesting substance. It's effectively made up of the kitchen sink of all sorts of different hydrocarbons. But the interesting thing in the way that impacts the areas where we're able to emplace the bio-oil is really about pore space and about the structure of the geology. So we are limited in the exact formations we can emplace into. However, our initial deployments are have enormous capacity. So it's formations that are very similar to structures that held oil over the last 100, 200, 300 million years. So you just kind of find a compatible geological formation and then ensure that your bio-oil is not going to polymerize over the timeline of your emplacement, which is one of the major challenges there. But yeah.
And the local regulation in the US acknowledges and knows how to deal with this?
We are definitely working a lot with regulators on sort of demo projects to help facilitate that research as well. And so this is a very sort of novel technology. Sort of the CO2 injection was able to build on top of decades of EOR research. No one's really been trying to in-place bio-oil yet. So we're working with researchers at a couple different universities as well as independent labs to sort of model the the bio oil in the subsurface. So.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, and then let's ask from Cristel. Can you explain how it is possible that gas actually remains underground? Why doesn't it escape? What characteristics does the geological formation have to have for it to be airtight, so to say?
Thank you, Antti, for the question. When we search for a reservoir for storage of CO2 in geological formations, we are looking for what we would call a classical trap, as seen in oil and gas, which means that we would need to have a cap rock, which is usually about 2,500 to 3,000 meters below the seabed. And it's like a roof above the reservoir. And we also need some faults, which would be sealing this rock formation. How does it actually work? It's important to say that for Northern Light, we actually store the CO2 in liquid form, not in gas. So it wouldn't be airtight, but more watertight, because it's very similar to water in terms of properties. It's the same mechanism actually keeping the CO2 underground as what is keeping, as per today, oil and gas underground for millions of years. They are the same which are used for storage of CO2, and they are natural mechanisms. And those mechanisms, there are actually four of them. The first is a structural trap, so the roof that we talked about, which we call the cap rock. And it provides a seal on the upper parts. Then there's a collection of the molecules of CO2 which are being trapped within those porous rock at the storage site, which acts like a sponge for these drops of CO2. The third mechanism, and all those can occur simultaneously, but also long over time. There's a dissolution of the liquid CO2, which actually dissolved in the saline aquifer water, which is already present in the porous rock formation. And last but not least, over time, I'm talking about several decades and hundreds of years, the CO2 which has been dissolved can react with the minerals and bind to the rock, which makes like a crystallization process. And usually after 10 years, we see that the cap rock represents only 50% of what contains the CO2, which means that the other process takes over from it. So to summarize, the longer the CO2 stays in the reservoir, the safer it gets. Now, of course, what are the characteristics of this reservoir? We need to have sufficient storage capacity. If the petrophysical characteristic needs to be good enough so that we don't overpressurize the reservoir, which means that the capacity needs to be sufficient. And the last point, but not the least, we have done this for over 25 years on field like Snæfell. So we have a very good experience. And we are also obliged to follow and monitor both the pressure in the reservoir to avoid this, to make sure that we don't overpressurize it, but also to follow what we call the CO2 plume, which is a CO2 dispersion into this the storage we have identified. And this we'll do with the 4D seismic, which means that we do regular seismic, we compare them, and we see how that CO2 plume is evolving within the storage. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That was thorough, indeed. So talking about EOR plus, Christian, there is a contradiction in EOR plus, of course. You are pumping out, or not you, but the people who are doing it would be pumping out fossil fuel from the well. How do you explain that this is good for the climate?
Yes, good question. I guess the first point which is important here is like from a pure like greenhouse gas accounting perspective, so doing really the balance. In this case of the method, we really just accounting for the plus, kind of like the additional carbon that is stored after discounting also like the carbon which we extract with the oil. So from a pure carbon perspective, in this case, like if you just account for the plus, there's a net negative emission. So I guess that's fine from this perspective. And the other thing is also like, which is a little bit like probably a broader discussion, but just to highlight the main points, like pure carbon capture and storage, the cost is really high, as we know. And there's no financial incentive to do that. So it's really difficult to attract private capital and operate those sites without having like a really high carbon price or specifically like subsidies or so. So it's considered a little bit in general also like these EOR operations, kind of like first they have been operating for a long time. So these operators have huge like track records, historical records, data, experience research. They have the experts also like to further like implement CCS, pure CCS in the future, and also like doing that through oil and gas operations like EOR plus. In this case, this also helps kind of like to bring down the costs through experience and equipment and everything. And then also maybe in the future, like to ramp up like pure CCS projects. So I guess it's important here also to see that a little bit as a transition. And that doesn't mean that EOR plus in 10 or 20 years still needs crediting. Maybe as we have seen like in renewables, where some standards like step out or start to exclude renewables, but at some point it was needed. And I guess here like EOR plus like is really one of the technologies or type of operations that can make this or help to make this transition to pure CCS in the future.
Okay, thank you. Very good. So moving on to Camilla. The shared transport and storage makes sense, but how can you measure amount of CO2 stored per capture operator, if they are sharing the same pipe leading to the storage? And of course, then the gases are mixed.
Well, thank you for the question. Just to give the attendees a short introduction to the BORG CO2 cluster that I'm representing, there is several sources and emitters linked together with the intentions of having a shared temporary storage at the BORG harbor. In the cluster, there is a biorefinery, there's a paper mill, and there are 3 different waste to energy plants. And through this feasibility study, we are currently in BORG CO2 has mapped a capture potential up to 630,000 tons of CO2, where approximately 70% of this is biogenic. So back to the question, the measuring of the amount of the CO2 finds place at the source where the CO2 is captured. And there it will be liquefied. In our project, we're looking into liquefying that at site and transporting it to the hub for temporary storage, where it may or may not be mixed. So from that hub, it's planned to be transported by Northern Lights, and of course meeting the specifications from the Northern Lights, as Cristel has talked about, to permanent storing geologically, as Mark and Marianne both explained. So BORG CO2 have not yet studied the chance of the measurements changing when mixing the CO2 from the different sources. However, the calculation parameters data provided for verification in the methodology are included in the measuring, and so that no emission avoided or reduced are included in the measuring. And of course, that's still only the biogenic fraction of the CO2 is counted and is eligible. So I hope that was a short answer to your question.
All right. Yes, very good. Thank you. All right, Jannicke. A little bit similar type of a question actually for you. Municipal waste that is incinerated for energy is a mix of different sources. So going back one step actually from this previous discussion, in this methodology only biogenic CO2 is accepted. How do you know which fraction of your municipal waste is biogenic?
Right. To begin with the waste to energy plant, as you point out, we are producing energy from the incineration of residual waste in the form of district heating and electricity. But this energy, of course, can only be recovered once. And that's why this is an end-of-line solution for the residual waste that we need to take out of the cycle, or that we cannot or don't want to recycle. And this is a necessary measure in the circular economy to enable the close down of landfills, which is the major contributor to methane emissions. So it's not an opposite to sorting and recycling that is usually a discussion, but it's an addition to, and it's an enabler for the circular economy. And this sorted and residual waste represents a large bio-CCS or BECCS potential due to the bio content in the waste. Because about 50% of the waste is from biological origin or biomass. And this is, of course, with the methodology presented here, something that we need to be very accurate about. in order to avoid double counting or other inaccuracies. And the most obvious way of doing this, and also the most accurate one, is to measure the CO2, the C14 content, the isotope, in the flue gas from the stack. This is perfectly eligible technology today. We have done it over a period at our plant in Oslo, and also several other plants are doing this on a regular basis. So this is definitely the most accurate and also the recommended method from the report.
Okay, good. Thank you. So so we have plenty of time here now for all kinds of questions, and I would actually like to start from the actual chat, live chat here, with an easy one to Marianne. So Marianne, is carbon stored in a landfill considered underground storage?
Yes, in this methodology that is not a part, so it doesn't fulfill the eligibility criteria. That is not the type of storage that is here, and it's also not the type of mechanism of conserving the biomass in this way that is described in this methodology. So that is a different carbon removal method.
Or that would be a different carbon removal method if it was possible, right?
Yes.
All right, and then moving to the next one, and I guess this could probably go to Cristel. Perhaps, what criteria do storage contracts need to meet to demonstrate the storage is intended to be permanent? Is there a good way to answer this, Cristel?
That's a difficult one. I would say that in the discussion we have with potential customers at the moment, there is no doubt that the CO2 is planned to be stored permanently. We are not planning to use that CO2. It is very clear that Northern Light has one objective and one only: it's to store permanently. So I'm not sure I have answered the question, but it will be the base for contract between capture sites and Northern Light. But that's really the only thing I can vouch for.
Okay, Marianne?
Yeah, I can fulfill from the methodology document itself that it defines that the contract has to show that the contract is with a storage site that is permitted under the EU or US law, and with that permission comes then the storage volume that it's permitted for the volume that this capture site needs. So those are the criteria as described in the methodology itself.
Okay, so the next question is, let's say, I'm not sure if I understand this thoroughly, but Louis actually already took up to answer that. Would you like to sort of first ask the question from yourself and then answer it, or reframe the question in a way that it's digestible? Louis, can you take that?
Can you repeat the question? So
the question where you...
Antti, I'm not sure that the link that Louis posted is exactly related to the question.
Okay.
Or was that how you meant it?
Yes, that was the way I meant my question, but I understand if Louis did not
really
respond to that. Okay, fair enough. So let's then discuss this. So I'll read it out loud here. So does the methodology consider biogenic carbon captured even if it wouldn't be released into the atmosphere in the short term if this capturing process does not take place? So I'm, would it be possible actually for Mariko to sort of open up this question a little bit so that we'll understand what is behind it? the challenge is, of course, that Mariko is not able to probably speak here.
I could maybe meanwhile try to answer how I understood it. So if we think of this biogenic CO2 that is captured and eligible in this methodology, it is always and already coming from a process that is there for another reason. So this capture process is not responsible or causing that biomass to be used for the originating process, whether it's bioenergy or waste incineration. The biomass was there already. So I think that in this methodology that is not a problem, and in other biomass using methodologies that should be looked at and made sustainable.
All right. Any other comments related to that? If not, yes. So going forward, Louis did indeed, in an unrelated comment, share this Nature journal article about the life cycle assessment of the direct air capture process, and indeed this very detailed analysis of the situation that I guess what you guys are running at Climeworks.
Exactly.
All right. And then we've got a next question from Anne Elizabeth. The corks are used for compensating, offsetting the GH or greenhouse gas emissions of the buying company. What are the additionality criteria? That is, how do your projects have to demonstrate that the carbon finance was essential in order to enable carbon removal? This is a good question that we get asked very frequently, and I think there are. So I could actually just take it and say that we've started out with projects that were there, but were sort of underutilized and therefore underdeveloped. And we felt that the acceleration effect of taking new revenue stream into that value chain would make it more competitive, and therefore it would start to develop faster. And this is exactly what has happened. We've seen our suppliers grow faster than they would have. So we've identified something that is good for the climate, and we've been able to accelerate that with the help of the buyers. So that was sort of the first phase. But now we are in the second phase, where we are seeing a bunch of projects and new processes that are not going to get started unless there is a long-term offtake agreement, just the same way as there was in the wind or renewable energy industry some time ago. So, we have projects that are 100% additional, sort of as defined according to the sort of the traditional criteria, but still all projects are obliged to use all the funds gathered in this marketplace for accelerating their development and growth of that particular business that they are running. I hope that opened that question a little bit, or answered that question.
There are questions, actually. I see two questions pointed to Cristel and asking about this leakage and monitoring. So if you could repeat what is done there and what do the authorities require, and is there a need for a third party? What are the risks, and is there a need for a third party additional monitoring of that?
Yes, so before we are granted, or when we apply for a storage application in this case to the Norwegian state, we have to, as part of this process of application, we have to establish what we call a storage complex monitoring plan, and this plan covers both the well but also the subsurface or the underground monitoring. In addition, that monitoring includes both standard monitoring, and also it needs to provide some indication that the CO2 behaves in the way which was expected based on our modelization. So we have to follow the Norwegian regulation for this. The Norwegian regulation are actually based on the EU CCS directive, and they include both the CO2 storage regulation, the petroleum regulation, which we are working under, as well as environmental regulation for the storage permit. And we need to comply with all those regulations. And there's also some guideline with very strong overlap between the two. So I wouldn't say that it's a third party as such, but we are, I mean, unless you consider the regulation as a third party, but this is quite a regulated process, really. It's not that we can decide to store the CO2 in any place without any kind of follow-up. So that's, I would say that would, I hope, answer the question. And of course, the leak monitoring is part of this storage complex monitoring plan.
And if you still say a few words about the risks of the CO2 after injection, how risky do you see? I mean, you have been working with the geology and storages and different substances in and out for decades. So how do you see the risk there?
I mean, if we can categorize a risk zero, I would say we are as close as can be. This is a very important part of the storage location selection process, as I was detailing before. There is a very thorough amount of work being performed to ensure that this storage complex is actually sealed both by the caprock and the fault on each side of it. If we were not having a sealed area, we would not be allowed to inject in it. That's also part of what we have to show. In our case, the Milieu Directorate and the Oil Directorate in Norway, at least. And as we said, we are really under stringent regulation because we still have to follow the petroleum regulation, although it is CO2, in addition to the CO2 storage. So we can be as close to a risk zero. I don't know if a risk zero exists completely, but it's also a very important point that when we do those 4D seismic I mentioned before, we do them at regular interval, and then we see how the CO2 plume is behaving. And if it doesn't behave the way we were expecting it, then we have to gather more data and update our models and see what's happening. So there is a constant monitoring, and the monitoring is over 100 years. It's not something we're going to stop when the project, for example, is finished. We have a duty to keep on following this storage location, at least for 25 years, and afterwards it is handed over, when the reservoir is handed over back to the government, there will still be a follow-up.
Okay, thank you very much. Very good. All right, then Paul asked a question to Jannicke. Could you comment on the variance of the C14 readings from waste incineration? How often do you expect to perform measurements in order to meet the methodology requirement?
Oh, that's a good question that I don't really know the detailed answer to. I know that we did the measurements over a period of about 3 months. And then basically calculated from these numbers and the measurements. But I also know that some plants in the Fortum group have a regular measurement every week of the C14 component, and that is especially relevant for the plants that are already included in the ETS system. They need to be accurate on their fossil versus their bio content. Okay. So how often? It's hard to say, but I would guess that due to the composition of the waste could vary through the season and through the year. So I believe that it should be quite regularly measured to be accurate.
Okay. Good. Then we have a short question to Marianne. Could compost storage also be a technology acceptable like biochar?
Yeah, if I understand correctly, compost is even more decomposing than the landfill. So I don't actually see how the compost is a storage or a permanent way to conserve biomass from decomposing. But if that could be the case, and you can show in which conditions and under which criteria it is not decaying or decomposing in the compost, then maybe yes, but not part of this geologically stored methodology.
Definitely not that, but of course we know that biochar is being mixed with compost, and that doesn't decrease the stability of the biochar itself. So in
if
that sense,
was the question, yes, then mixing biochar with a lot of things keeps the biochar intact. It has changed its molecule structure so that it does not decompose in soil or compost or that kind of mixtures.
Yeah. Then there's another question about additionality. I tried to cover that with the acceleration discussion, and that has also been addressed by Joona in the comments over there earlier. So we have another question. I'm not sure if this is for Cristel or for somebody else. Do you see the availability of locations for long-term underground storage as a bottleneck for geological storage, especially concerning scaling up CO2 removal?
Yes, that's a very good question. I would say the problem is not so much the availability, it's the time it takes to mature the storage location. As you know, for oil and gas, it takes a very long time before we starting looking at licenses and before we actually find something. In this case, we are finding, in a way, empty reservoir or aquifer filled reservoir, which is the opposite of what we do in oil and gas. But it takes a very long time because we have to gather sufficient data, seismic, modelization, and this is a very time-consuming process. So I would say it's more the time it takes, which is the bottleneck, more than the geological formation, because in addition to saline aquifer, we could also use depleted field, which is something which is looked into as well, and there are a lot of depleted field from oil and gas industry.
Okay.
Maybe just to build on that as well, that the availability of storage won't necessarily be a barrier. It will be the deployment of CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, which will be the main bottleneck at this stage.
Okay, good.
Yeah, and I would second that from Charm's perspective as well. I mean, partially what we discussed with this is there's at least the capacity for the storage of the oil that's already been removed. And there's anyone in the oil and gas industry will tell you that they've drilled for oil and not found it in similar formations that will store it. So the capacity is there.
Okay, good. All right. Now a question related to regulation and CCS directive in Europe by Eve Tamme. It specifies that in the case of leakage, the CO2 that has leaked has to be covered with the EU ETS allowances. It doesn't matter if the stored CO2 came from an emission source that was EU ETS. It could also be from direct air capture or something else outside of the scope of EU ETS. This creates some uncertainty as we don't know if the EU ETS will be around if there's a leakage, say 50 years from now. Who will take on the responsibility for surrendering these allowances when using this technology? Wow, that is a tough one. Somebody want to take a shot at it?
I would direct this to Brussels. How about Mark?
Well, it's the $1,000 question, I think. I'm not sure there is an answer to that right now, to be honest. I think for the CCS directive, it's less of a concern than, so for CCS types of removals, it's less of a concern than it might be for nature-based removals, because CCS is much more permanent, but also because there isn't actually such a mechanism for land sinks. So I think it's a very good question, but I don't have an answer and I will flip that to how do we answer that for nature-based, because that's maybe a little more urgent.
I liked Cristel's saying that the longer the CO2 stays in the storage, the more permanent it is. So maybe we hope that 50 years is enough. Antti, we are closing.
If I could just add something. In the meantime, before we reach 50 years, it is very clear that in a CCS value chain, if there is a leakage, at least before the storage part and along the process for transport and interim storage and so on, we are under obligation to compensate on the ETS. And we also, when it's as soon as the CO2 is arriving in our facility in Norway, we are also under the Norwegian tax for the carbon, which will be even higher than the ETS. So that's important to mention.
Okay. So acknowledging, Marianne, that we do have some final questions to be asked, I think we probably maybe should just allow to Rita's question quickly. Rita asked about where do you see the biggest markets for DACCS? Is it based on geography, low electricity prices, or certain industries that could benefit from DACCS or something else? Is that something that Louis could perhaps take?
Yeah, I would say so. So basically, DACCS, it's location independent to the point that we are looking for suitable storage places. So it makes no sense to capture something at one point on the globe and then to have to transport it to a storage site that is at the other end of the globe. So that might be one limitation. Not that it cannot be overcome with transporting CO2 over long distances, which is being done and which Northern Lights looks at, especially in Europe. But then I would say it also comes down to renewable energy availability and potentially also the overall policy environment. So as we speak now, it's in our globally seen, it's mostly free of any costs to deposit your CO2 in the atmosphere. And what we are trying to do is get it out of the atmosphere, and this results in some costs. So we are looking in markets that have a political awareness of that cost, I would say, so that we are being considered as an effective pathway to removing CO2 from the air, and this comes at a certain price. And so we look at markets where we have either policies in place, regulations in place, where the basically dumping of CO2 into the atmosphere is costly and direct air capture becomes a means of compensating for it.
Yeah, and you have access to cheap renewable energy. Yeah, all right. So let's go around the panelists. So Marianne explained how trade-offs and harmonization across technologies were discussed in the work group. How did you feel about that way of working? Is that something that who could perhaps start? Jannicke, perhaps? You are on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think it was a very interesting work to be a part of, as the working group was put together with different people from different areas with the different views, and also with different views to the and definitely bringing in complex dilemmas when it comes to finding a methodology that could be used for all these situations and all these different industries. So I think it was really really interesting, and I believe we all learned a lot from other point of views. Thank you.
I did, at least. I've learned a lot by listening in on some of the conversations. So I thought it was very straightforward from the beginning, but the devil really is in the detail. So good work there for tackling the detail, the devils, so to say. Anybody else want to continue from here? Any other comments?
Laura from Gaia Consulting was the lead author of this technology paper, and you were attending the workgroup meetings. So could you unmute yourself and say how was this group? How was it manageable?
Yes, thank you, Marianne, and thank you for all of you in the working group. We had indeed very detailed and interesting questions on multiple topics, and I would say that the Puro's approach that we try to base on the existing methodologies where we can, for example, the sustainability of the biomass or the storage criteria is a good starting point, that we have something we can ground on, and then what is left in the middle, what is not yet solved, we use this kind of multi-view groups to see each other's point of view, and then combine an approach that is both kind of sustainable and ensures the carbon net negativity, and then also is applicable in practice. That is also important point, to have this methodology ongoing so that it can actually be applied and is possible to kind of fulfill the criteria in a sustainable manner. So I would say quite a successful conversations in the work group.
Yeah, indeed. Very good. So who would like to answer the question that what is the one thing that you would want the audience to remember about this geologically stored methodology or carbon methodology? Camilla, you look like, yes, go ahead.
Sure, I'll do that. Well, I just think this has just been really great to be a part of, and to take home only the biogenic fraction of the CO2 capture is eligible. I just think that that's one thing that we all have to have with us when we leave this webinar. So thank you.
Okay, great. Good point, indeed. So, Mark, you in the beginning of this session, you presented the definition of carbon removal. Is this what we have now been discussing and what was presented by Marianne and discussed here? Is that something that sort of is good with the definition?
I think that the methodology that Puro has developed for the CCS, for carbon removals with CCS, perfectly falls within the principles of carbon dioxide removal. Explicit mentioning of the source of the carbon dioxide, that it must come from the atmosphere or from a biogenic source. The fact that it has to be stored in manner intended to be permanent. I think those two principles are met very, very well. There's no doubt about that. And when it comes to the life cycle assessment, we've taken a sufficiently broad perspective, which looks at the sustainability of the biomass, and also the potential for EOR has also been included, with the caveat that you need to store more than carbon you would be emitting with the oil, which is very important to include because sometimes that's forgotten. So overall, I think it's a very good methodology. And,
good.
Yeah, I think you've done some good work.
Thank you. Any final words, Marianne, perhaps?
Yes, actually, if you would take the last slide. Sure. So until end of February, still 2 weeks, this methodology is open for comments and consultation. So please do give your feedback. If there is something we've missed or should be improved, we would be happy to include it now. And then we are looking forward to actually putting this in action with the installations that are already removing carbon to geological storages or planning to do so.
Yeah. So let me just paste that link into the chat here. Of course, that will be sent to you over email as well. But for the ones that want to jump into it straight away, this is the fastest way to access that feedback form.
Yes.
All right. Very good. So thank you on my behalf. Thank you on behalf of the Puro team and the whole working group, I believe. Also, thanks for the interest. Personally, I was really surprised to see 200 people signing up for these 2 sessions, or more than 200 actually. So many people will get this information and hopefully will make the wheels turn.
Excellent. Thank you.
Have a good evening. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.